The year 2008 changed the way millions of people think about money. If you have ever felt nervous opening your bank app or wondered why money feels unsafe, that fear has roots in what happened during the financial crash. This video will help you understand that hidden pain and why it still shapes how people like you see money today. You will hear the story of how families lost homes, how jobs disappeared, and how trust in the system broke apart. You will learn why the crash happened, who was hurt the most, and what lessons remain. By the end, you will see not only what went wrong, but also what helps people heal after financial trauma. That is the gift of staying until the end. This is not a lecture about economics. This is a slow bedtime journey that shows you the emotional side of money. Every chapter is designed to keep you calm, even while the story explores difficult moments. The pacing is gentle, so you can relax as you listen, and the lessons are simple enough that even a 12-year-old can follow along without strain. Why should you stay with this story? Because when you understand the crash in a safe way, you understand yourself better. Many of the money fears you carry were born during that time. Even if you were young, the echoes reached your family, your community, and the way banks and jobs still work today. By hearing the whole journey, you can sleep tonight with more clarity and less tension. The first payoff you will get is understanding the real cause of the crisis. People often believe it was only about greedy bankers or careless borrowers, but the truth is more complex. You will hear how everyday families were set up with loans that looked safe but were fragile, and how those small cracks spread through the whole system. The second payoff is seeing the human cost. Numbers are one thing, but what matters is what people lived through. You will hear about the millions of homes that were lost, the millions of jobs that disappeared, and the deep scars those losses left on people's hearts. Knowing this helps explain why financial anxiety still lingers today, even if the economy has recovered. The third payoff is learning the gentle lessons that help you now. By the end of this story, you will hear how people rebuilt, what new protections were put in place, and what simple habits make you feel safe again. These are not promises of wealth. They are the soft truths that bring peace of mind. You might wonder why you should spend 2 hours on this story. The reason is simple. The 2008 crash is one of the most important financial events of modern history, and it touches your daily life even if you do not notice. By staying, you will connect the dots between what happened then and how you feel about money now. And you will leave with calm knowledge instead of restless worry. Think of this as a gentle walk through the past. Each chapter takes you step by step, from the quiet years before the crash, to the storm itself, to the slow recovery that followed. By pacing it slowly, you can absorb the lessons without overwhelm. You can let the story wash over you while you drift toward sleep, knowing you are learning something that matters. The story begins with the calm before the storm. You will see how families felt secure, how banks made loans easy, and how the dream of owning a home spread everywhere. At first, it felt safe, but hidden risks were building. That is where we begin, and that is where the next chapter will take you. The story of the financial crash does not start with panic. It begins with quiet confidence. In the early 2000s, across small towns and large cities, families felt like they were stepping into a stable future. Owning a home was not only a dream, but a symbol of success. For many, the belief was simple. If you worked hard, saved a little, and borrowed what you needed, life would keep moving upward. In neighborhoods across the country, signs of growth were everywhere. New houses went up quickly, and construction crews worked through long days. Couples held housewarming parties, inviting friends to see freshly painted walls and newly planted gardens. Mortgage approval letters arrived in the mail like gifts. The mood was one of trust. People believed the system wanted them to succeed, that banks were partners in building their lives. At first glance, everything seemed steady. Interest rates were low, which made borrowing cheaper. Families who once thought they would never afford a home were suddenly handed the keys. Real estate agents spoke with cheerful voices about rising property values. Banks encouraged buyers to take larger loans, promising that the investment would only grow. The message was clear. Homeownership was the safest step anyone could take. What people did not see were the fragile threads holding it all together. Many loans had hidden features that would cause payments to rise later. Adjustable rate mortgages offered low monthly costs in the beginning, but they were set to climb. Some loans required almost no proof of income. Others required no down payment at all. On the surface, these deals looked like open doors, but beneath them lay traps that would snap shut when conditions shifted. Still, no one was looking for danger in a time of plenty. When neighbors saw each other buying homes, it felt natural to join in. When banks said yes, few asked questions. It was as if a cultural tide carried everyone along. Young couples, retirees, single parents, and first-generation families all stepped forward, believing they were taking part in something safe and smart. The air was filled with optimism, like a calm sky before an unseen storm. The belief in endless growth was strong. Home values rose year after year. Families saw their net worth climb on paper. If someone borrowed too much, they felt reassured that selling later would cover the difference. The story people told themselves was comforting. Real estate always goes up. That phrase, repeated again and again, made risky choices feel secure. It silenced doubt and encouraged people to stretch beyond what they could comfortably afford. Banks and lenders kept fueling the fire. They approved loans for people with lower credit scores, often called subprime borrowers. These loans carried higher risks, but were bundled into financial products that were sold to investors around the world. By packaging them together, banks claimed the risk was small. These products were given high ratings, making them seem as reliable as government bonds. In truth, the structure was delicate, like a tower built on unsteady ground. Families did not see the complexity. They only saw the front door opening, the papers signed, the keys handed over. For them, it was personal. It meant children running through hallways, meals cooked in new kitchens, and a feeling of safety that came from having a place of their own. It was hard to imagine that the very loans granting this security were setting them up for future pain. But that is how the calm before the storm works. Everything feels steady until the first drop of rain falls. In those years, advertisements for mortgages filled television screens. Bankers reassured customers with smiles. Politicians celebrated rising home ownership rates, calling it a victory for the American dream. Few stopped to ask if the foundation was solid. People believed what they wanted to believe. Growth felt endless. Safety felt guaranteed. Doubt was the voice that no one wanted to hear. There were signs, but they were easy to ignore. Some economists warned that home prices were rising too fast compared to incomes. Others pointed out that families were taking on debts they might not manage if interest rates went up. But those voices were quiet against the louder chorus of confidence. As long as payments were being made and prices were climbing, it was easy to look away from the cracks forming in the foundation. For a family sitting at their table during those years, the math seemed simple. If they could make the first year of payments, the future would sort itself out. If the loan adjusted later, they believed they could refinance. If income fell, they thought they could sell. Each assumption was tied to the same belief. Housing prices would not fall. With that belief, the risks faded into the background, replaced by hope. Children growing up in this period saw parents talk with pride about owning a home. They absorbed the message that houses meant stability. They did not hear about the details of the mortgage contract or the risk of rising payments. To them, the home was a symbol of arrival. It was a milestone that seemed natural and right. These impressions would shape how they thought about money for years to come, even when the story turned dark. Looking back, the calm before the storm had a rhythm. Families worked, banks lent, houses sold, and prices climbed. It felt like a machine that could not break. But the truth was that the machine was running hot, fueled by borrowed money and risky bets. The more it ran, the more fragile it became. And yet, on the surface, everything still looked calm. That is what made the coming shift so jarring. This chapter is about that stillness, that moment in history when almost everyone believed the dream was secure. It is important to sit here for a while, because without understanding the piece that came first, the shock of the crash does not fully land. For millions of people, the storm would feel like betrayal, precisely because of how safe the calm once seemed. As you rest tonight, hold this picture. Families moving into homes, neighborhoods filled with optimism, banks encouraging dreams, and a country confident in its growth. This is where the story begins. It begins not in fear, but in trust. That trust will matter when we turn to the next chapter, because it explains why the collapse was so painful. People lost more than houses or jobs. They lost faith in a system they once believed was unshakable. The calm before the storm is the memory of safety. It is the moment when the sky is clear and no one carries an umbrella. It is where our story pauses now, as the pressure quietly builds beneath the surface. And in the next chapter, you will see how the bubble grew larger, brighter, and thinner with every passing month, until it was ready to burst. The calm that filled the early 2000s gave way to a new energy. Housing prices were not only rising, they were racing upward. Each month seemed to bring news of record sales and higher values. What began as steady growth soon turned into a rush. Families who already owned homes felt richer on paper, and those still renting worried they were missing their chance. The dream of homeownership became a race against time. The banks and lenders did everything possible to keep that race going. They offered more loans, faster approvals, and deals that seemed too good to refuse. Adjustable rate mortgages gave people low initial payments, almost like a teaser. Interest-only loans meant some borrowers were not even paying down their debt, only covering interest in the hope that their home's rising value would protect them later. Every product was designed to pull more people into the market. Investors added fuel to the fire. Banks bundled thousands of mortgages together and sold them as securities. These bundles looked safe on the outside because the risk was spread out, or so it was claimed. Ratings agencies stamped them with approval, giving investors confidence. Pension funds, insurance companies, and global banks all bought in, trusting that the U.S. housing market would never fail. The bubble was not just national, it was worldwide. The everyday family did not see those layers. What they saw were open doors and smiling approvals. A teacher could buy a second property. A young couple could purchase a home larger than they ever thought possible. Parents could refinance and pull out cash to pay for college or renovations. The story was that everyone deserved a piece of the dream. The system made it easy to believe this was both possible and safe. As more people entered the market, demand pushed prices even higher. It created a cycle that felt unstoppable. Rising prices convinced more people to buy quickly before costs climbed further. Builders rushed to put up new homes, confident they would sell. Sellers raised prices without fear that buyers would walk away. The belief that prices only went in one direction grew stronger every month. For those on the outside, the pressure was intense. Renters watched as homeownership seemed to slip further away. Young adults felt they had to jump in, even if they were not ready. Parents told their children that buying was the smartest move they could make. Fear of missing out became a powerful driver. Each new headline about soaring values added to the urgency. Banks saw opportunity in that urgency. They began lending to people with weaker credit, people who in another era would have been denied. These were called subprime borrowers, but the term did not mean much to families who were simply thrilled to be approved. Many were given loans without strict checks on income or savings. For the first time, almost anyone could buy a home, and almost everyone did. The bubble swelled as more money poured in. Prices of homes in many cities doubled in less than a decade. Some areas saw even faster growth. Investors who once bought stocks turned to housing instead, buying multiple properties to rent or sell later. Ordinary people became part-time speculators, confident they could flip a house for profit in a few months. What had been a stable market turned into a frenzy. On the surface, life looked good. People drove through neighborhoods with sold signs on nearly every lawn. New shopping centers opened near growing suburbs. Families felt proud to talk about how much their homes were worth now compared to when they bought them. The atmosphere was cheerful, like everyone had found a secret key to wealth. Few paused to ask whether the key was made of paper. Behind the optimism, though, stress was building. Loans with low introductory rates began to edge higher. Some families found themselves stretched thin. Others depended on refinancing to keep their payments manageable, counting on home values to rise fast enough to cover the debt. As long as prices climbed, they could stay afloat. But if prices slowed or fell, the math would stop working. This fragile balance did not worry most people yet. The memory of the calm years was strong, and the belief in endless growth kept doubts quiet. Even those who sensed the risks often ignored them. A voice inside might whisper that payments were getting harder, but another voice insisted that the house would be worth more next year. It was easier to believe the second voice. Policymakers and media joined in the chorus of optimism. Reports celebrated the highest homeownership rates in history. Political leaders praised the accessibility of credit and the spread of the dream. Articles highlighted success stories of families who had doubled their wealth through real estate. The narrative was simple and comforting. This was progress. The American dream was stronger than ever. In reality, the dream was stretched thin. Each new buyer relied on the next to keep prices moving higher. Each lender relied on the belief that packaged loans were safe. Each investor relied on the assumption that the system was too big to fail. Together, it created a bubble that looked dazzling but was fragile to the core. By 2006, the pace was unsustainable. Prices in many regions had climbed far beyond what local incomes could support. Families were taking on mortgages that consumed most of their earnings. Debt levels were rising faster than wages. Some neighborhoods were filled with new homes that sat empty because buyers had been priced out. These were the quiet cracks in the bubble's surface. The cracks grew wider when the first wave of adjustable rates reset. Families who had enjoyed low payments suddenly faced much higher bills. Some scrambled to refinance, only to find it harder to get approval. Others began missing payments. Foreclosure notices started to appear. Not many at first, but enough to signal change. For those paying attention, the storm was beginning to show itself. Still, most people believed the bubble would keep expanding. After all, it had grown for years. It felt impossible that it would suddenly stop. The momentum was too strong. Even those who saw trouble often thought it would only affect others. Their own home, their own loan, their own job felt safe. It was easier to believe that the storm would pass them by. But bubbles do not grow forever. They stretch until they can stretch no more, and then they burst. By 2007, the pressure inside the housing bubble was too much. Prices began to flatten in some areas, then slip in others. Families who had planned to sell for a profit found fewer buyers. Loans that once looked manageable turned into heavy burdens. The sense of security began to fade. The bubble had grown beyond reason, and now it was trembling. It held within it millions of families, banks, and investors, all tied together by fragile promises. When it burst, the damage would not be contained. It would spread through the financial system, through neighborhoods, through lives, and the calm of the past would feel like a distant memory. This chapter has shown you how the bubble swelled, how trust and fear combined to feed it, and how the signs of strain began to appear. It is important to understand this growth because it explains why the fall was so devastating. People were not prepared for the possibility that the tide could turn. They believed in endless expansion until the moment it stopped. In the next part of this story, we will step into those early cracks. We will see how families began to struggle with rising payments, how lenders started to collapse, and how the first drops of rain signaled the storm to come. It is the moment when optimism turned to doubt and when whispers of trouble grew louder. The bubble looked dazzling from the outside, but inside, the structure was weak. Families were buying homes with loans that seemed simple at first glance, but the details carried risks that many did not understand. Payments started low, sometimes so low they felt almost like rent. But hidden in the contract were clauses that would push those payments higher over time. These were called adjustable rate mortgages, and they became one of the most dangerous cracks in the system. In the beginning, the low rates made people feel confident. A family could buy a house that seemed far beyond their reach, and for the first year or two, they managed to keep up. But when the adjustment period arrived, the monthly bill jumped sharply. What had felt manageable suddenly felt like a mountain. Some tried to refinance, only to learn that their homes were worth less than they had expected. Others tried to juggle extra jobs or credit cards to cover the shortfall, slipping deeper into stress. Banks encouraged this fragile setup because they were not holding on to most of the loans. Instead, they were bundling thousands together and selling them as investment products. To investors, the bundles looked strong, stamped with ratings that promised safety. But inside those packages were loans made to borrowers who were barely holding on. If one fell behind, others quickly followed. The structure was like a row of dominoes, waiting for the first piece to tilt. Many borrowers did not realize how precarious their situation was. They believed that as long as home prices kept climbing, they could always sell or refinance. The problem was that by 2006 and 2007, prices had stopped climbing in many areas. Families who thought they had built equity were shocked to learn that their homes were worth less than their loans. This left them trapped, unable to sell without owing money, and unable to manage the higher payments. For some, this was the first time money felt like a betrayal. They had trusted the system. They had trusted the papers they signed. They had trusted the promises of lenders who told them everything would be fine. Now they found themselves with bills they could not pay and homes they could not keep. The sense of security that had once been so strong began to crumble, replaced by fear and shame. Communities started to notice the signs, A neighbor's house with a foreclosure notice taped to the door. A family quietly packing boxes in the middle of the night. Empty homes left behind with weeds growing tall in the yard. These were not just financial problems, they were emotional shocks that spread through neighborhoods, breaking the illusion that everyone was safe. The calm of the bubble years gave way to whispers of unease. The banks themselves began to wobble. The mortgage companies that specialized in subprime loans saw their profits vanish when borrowers fell behind. One after another, they collapsed, leaving behind unfinished promises and shattered confidence. By early 2007, dozens of these lenders had gone bankrupt. Their fall was a warning that the trouble was not limited to families. The very institutions that had fueled the boom were now buckling under the weight of their own risky choices. Investors started to panic as well. The bundles of mortgages that once seemed rock solid were suddenly filled with uncertainty. No one knew how many loans inside them would fail, or how much money would be lost. Banks stopped trusting each other. Credit, the lifeblood of the financial system, began to freeze. What had once flowed freely between institutions slowed to a trickle, and fear spread through boardrooms as quickly as it spread through living rooms. For everyday people, the complexity of these financial products was invisible. What they saw was more direct. Bills arriving in the mail, calls from collectors, jobs feeling less secure, savings accounts running low. The cracks in the foundation of the system were now cracks in their daily lives. The dream of owning a home was turning into the nightmare of losing it, and the shame of telling children why they had to leave. This chapter is about the unraveling of trust. When the foundation of a house begins to shift, the walls crack, the doors stick, and the structure becomes unsafe. In the same way, the foundation of the financial system was slipping. Families who had believed in stability were now holding contracts that betrayed them. Banks that had promised strength were showing weakness. The ground beneath millions of people felt unstable, and the fear of collapse was no longer abstract. It was lived. Some tried to hold on with hope. They told themselves the downturn was temporary. They believed prices would bounce back, or that a new loan would rescue them. Others tried to cut their losses, walking away from homes they could no longer afford. Each choice carried pain. Each decision was heavy, and the collective weight of these choices began to drag the system further down. The fear was not only financial, it was emotional. People felt they had failed, even when they had been set up to stumble. Parents worried about their children's stability. Workers worried about their futures. The shame of foreclosure was deep, even though it was widespread. Money was no longer just numbers on paper. It was fear in the chest, knots in the stomach, sleepless nights filled with questions that had no easy answers. The system's shaky foundation spread anxiety everywhere. Investors were nervous. Governments were concerned. Families were frightened. The idea that money was safe, that homes were secure, and that banks were reliable was cracking apart. And with every crack, the storm drew closer. This is why understanding the shaky foundation matters. Without it, the crash of 2008 seems like it came out of nowhere. In truth, the storm had been building for years. The loans, the bundles, the risks, and the misplaced trust were all part of a structure that looked strong but was fragile. When the weight became too heavy, collapse was inevitable. As you rest tonight, remember the picture of these foundations shifting. Families struggling with rising payments, banks faltering under their own products, investors pulling back in fear. The story is about to reach a new stage, one where the first cracks widen into open breaks. The storm is gathering force, and soon it will hit with full strength. The cracks in the foundation were no longer hidden. By 2006, the first signs of trouble were spreading across the country. Home prices that had seemed unstoppable began to slow. In some cities, they even started to fall. Families who had counted on rising values to protect them were shocked. The belief that houses always gained worth was breaking, and with it came a quiet fear. Monthly bills were climbing as adjustable-rate mortgages reset. What had once been a manageable payment became something many families could no longer cover. Letters from banks arrived, warning of overdue balances. Phone calls came more often, pressing people for money they did not have. For the first time, the weight of the bubble was being felt in ordinary living rooms. Foreclosure notices appeared on more doors. Neighbors, who once smiled proudly while mowing their lawns, were now packing boxes in silence. Empty houses dotted neighborhoods like missing teeth in a once bright smile. Each one was a warning that the calm years were over. The sight of families moving out under stress was no longer rare. It was becoming part of the landscape. The lenders who had built their business on risky loans began to collapse. Dozens of mortgage companies failed in the first months of 2007. These were the same lenders who had promised that credit was safe and easy. Their downfall spread worry through the system. If the companies that made the loans were failing, what did that mean for the banks holding the loans and the investors who had bought them? The financial world began to sense the storm ahead. Investors who once trusted mortgage-backed securities now questioned them. Banks that once loaned freely to each other became cautious. The flow of credit slowed. Trust, which had always been the quiet fuel of the system, was running thin. Without trust, money stopped moving. And without money moving, the whole economy felt the squeeze. For ordinary people, the warnings came in more personal ways. A family tried to refinance and was denied. A worker applied for a loan and was told no, even though a year before it would have been yes. A small business owner found their credit line cut, leaving them unable to buy supplies. What had once been open doors were now shutting fast. The signals were clear, even if many did not yet understand their full meaning. The news began to cover the story more closely. Reports of failing lenders filled the headlines. Commentators debated whether the housing boom had turned to bust. Some said it was a temporary dip. Others warned it was the start of something bigger. For families watching at home, the uncertainty itself was stressful. They did not know whom to believe, but they could feel the tension growing. Communities hardest hit by subprime lending felt the storm warnings more quickly. In some neighborhoods, rows of houses sat empty. Local governments worried about falling property taxes. Schools saw students leave as families moved away. Entire towns began to feel the weight of a shrinking base. These were not abstract warnings. They were lived changes in the texture of daily life. By the summer of 2007, the signs were impossible to ignore. Major investment funds tied to mortgages began to lose value. When investors tried to withdraw their money, they found the funds frozen. The products that were once considered safe were now filled with uncertainty. This fear spread through Wall Street like sparks through dry grass. The system was heating up, and people sensed fire on the horizon. Banks started to report losses, some in the billions. These were not small institutions. They were names people trusted, names seen on every main street. The idea that such banks could be shaken frightened everyone from individual savers to large investors. Each announcement was like thunder rolling in the distance. The storm was not yet overhead, but the sound was growing louder. Families who had once felt distant from Wall Street now felt its shadow. A parent worried if their retirement account would hold its value. A young worker wondered if their job was safe. A homeowner worried if their house would sell if they needed to move. Questions multiplied, and with them came sleepless nights. The storm warnings were not only financial, they were emotional, seeping into people's sense of safety. Still, some clung to hope. They believed the downturn would be brief, that the system was too large to fail entirely. They looked for reassurances in official statements and optimistic forecasts. But hope was weaker now, chipped away by the daily signs of strain. People were no longer celebrating the value of their homes. They were watching nervously, waiting to see what would happen next. The storm warnings spread across industries. Car sales slowed as fewer people qualified for loans. Retailers reported weaker spending as families tightened their budgets. Builders paused projects as unsold houses piled up. The ripple effects were everywhere. It was clear that this was not only a housing problem, it was becoming an economic problem that touched everyone. What made this period so unsettling was the uncertainty. No one knew how bad it would get or how far it would spread. Was it a passing storm, or was it the start of a deep collapse? This lack of clarity was its own form of stress. People feared making the wrong decision, feared losing what they had worked for, feared a future that seemed less stable each day. The calm before the storm had passed. The shaky foundations had been revealed. And now the warnings filled the air, loud enough that no one could ignore them. The sky was darkening, and people felt it in their bones. The question was no longer if a storm was coming. It was when and how hard it would hit. This chapter leaves us on the edge of that storm. The signs are everywhere. Families are falling behind. Banks are failing. Investors are pulling back. Communities are hurting. The warnings are clear, and yet the full force has not yet struck. That moment is coming soon, and when it does, it will change lives across the country and around the world. The warnings had been growing louder, but when the storm finally hit, it was harsher than most people imagined. In the fall of 2008, the financial system that had once looked unshakable began to unravel in front of everyone's eyes. News broke of one of the largest investment banks in the country filing for bankruptcy. The name was known around the world, a company that had been around for more than a century and a half. When it fell, it signaled that no institution was too big to fail. The collapse set off a chain reaction. Other banks that had been weakened by mortgage losses now faced the same fear. Investors questioned whether their money was safe. People lined up at branches worried that the banks might run out of cash. Trust, the invisible glue that held the financial system together, was breaking down. Each day seemed to bring another headline about a firm in trouble, another reminder that the storm was now overhead. The stock market reacted with panic. Values that had taken years to build were cut in half in a matter of months. Retirement accounts shrank. College funds disappeared. Families who had carefully saved for decades opened their statements and saw numbers slashed to levels they had not seen in years. For many, it felt like years of hard work had vanished in a single season. The shock was not only financial, it was deeply personal. Jobs quickly followed the decline. Companies that could no longer borrow money or sell their products began cutting workers. Factories slowed, stores closed, and offices downsized. Within months, millions of people were unemployed. Families who had been comfortable suddenly faced the loss of their main source of income. Some lost their jobs just as their mortgage payments rose. The timing turned stress into crisis. At home, the storm showed itself in daily struggles. Parents tried to stretch groceries further. Children overheard worried conversations about bills. Vacations were canceled, medical care delayed, and plans for the future put on hold. Even those who kept their jobs felt the weight of fear, wondering if they would be next. The storm was not only outside in the markets and banks, it was inside households, inside minds, inside hearts. Governments scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings took place to decide how to keep the system from collapsing completely. Plans were made to rescue banks with large sums of money, aiming to restore confidence. Interest rates were cut to make borrowing easier. The language of bailouts and stimulus entered everyday conversations, even if the details were hard to follow. What people understood was simple. The system was broken, and drastic steps were being taken to fix it. For many, these government actions brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief that leaders were stepping in to prevent total collapse. Others felt anger, wondering why large institutions were being saved, while ordinary families were left to struggle. The contrast was painful. A bank might receive billions in support, while a neighbor lost their home. This anger stayed with people long after the storm passed, shaping how they thought about money and fairness. The storm also shook the global economy, because banks and investors around the world had bought into American housing securities. The crisis spread quickly. Markets in Europe, Asia, and beyond tumbled. Companies that depended on global trade were hit. The storm that began with U.S. housing spread into a worldwide financial hurricane. The sense of instability was everywhere, reaching far beyond American neighborhoods. For those living through it, the storm did not feel abstract. It felt like standing in high winds, unable to hold on to the things you thought were secure. One week, a family felt stable. The next week, their job was gone, their savings cut, and their home at risk. The speed of the collapse left people feeling disoriented, as if the ground beneath them had shifted overnight. Fear became a constant companion. Families asked themselves questions they had never considered before. Is the money in the bank safe? Will my company survive? Can we keep our home? The lack of clear answers made the fear heavier. Even turning on the news added stress, as each report seemed worse than the last. The storm was loud, relentless, and close. The emotional toll was deep. People blamed themselves for choices they had made, even though much of the crisis was beyond their control. They replayed decisions about loans, spending, and investments, wondering what they should have done differently. Shame crept in alongside fear. It was hard to see that millions of others were facing the same struggles and that no single person caused the storm. The burden felt personal, even when it was shared. Communities tried to support each other. Food banks saw long lines. Churches and nonprofits organized help for families in need. Neighbors helped neighbors with small acts of kindness. sharing meals or watching children while parents searched for work. These moments of care stood out against the backdrop of fear. They showed that even in the harshest storm, people still looked out for one another. The storm also left permanent changes. Businesses learned the danger of relying on easy credit. Regulators began drafting new rules to prevent the same collapse from happening again. Families began saving more when they could, knowing how quickly stability could disappear. The crash taught hard lessons that lasted for years, shaping behavior long after the immediate crisis had passed. Still, in the middle of the storm, lessons were hard to see. What people felt most was loss. Loss of homes, loss of jobs, loss of trust. The storm stripped away the comfort of believing that systems were solid. It revealed how fragile financial life could be, and that fragility left scars that lasted even after recovery began. This chapter is the moment when everything broke open. The calm was gone, the foundations had cracked, the warnings had turned into reality. The storm was here, and no one could fully escape its force. Understanding this moment is key, because it explains the depth of the fear and the shape of the scars that followed. As you rest tonight, hold the image of this storm in your mind, not to frighten, but to understand. The winds were strong, the damage widespread, but storms do not last forever. After the winds fade, what remains is the struggle to rebuild, to heal, and to carry the memory forward. That is where the story leads next. The storm was no longer distant, it was now inside neighborhoods, inside families, and inside the quiet of daily life. When the financial crash reached full force, one of the clearest signs of its damage was the loss of homes. What had once been symbols of pride and security became heavy burdens that many people could no longer hold on to. The dream of ownership, so carefully built during the calm years, began to collapse. Foreclosure became a word that families knew too well. Notices appeared taped to doors. Letters came in the mail demanding payment that could not be made. Families who had worked hard to buy a home found themselves forced to leave it. For many, it was not only a financial event, it was an emotional wound. A home carries memories of birthdays, first steps, holiday meals, and everyday routines. To lose it was to lose more than walls and a roof. It was to lose a piece of identity. The numbers were overwhelming. Millions of homes went into foreclosure during these years. Each statistic represented a family's story. Parents explained to children why they had to move. Belongings were packed into boxes, sometimes with little time to prepare. Whole neighborhoods changed as houses emptied. Some streets had more vacant homes than occupied ones. Grass grew tall in yards, windows were boarded up, and silence replaced the noise of daily life. The impact spread beyond the families who left. Neighbors who stayed behind felt the change to property values dropped when houses stood empty. Local businesses saw fewer customers. Communities that once felt strong and connected now felt fragile. The sight of abandoned homes was a reminder of how quickly stability could fade. The loss was collective as well as individual. For children, the loss of a home was confusing. They had painted their rooms, played in backyards, and walked the same paths to school. Suddenly, those places were gone. Their toys were packed, their friends left behind, and their sense of safety shaken. Even young children carried the memory of being uprooted. It became part of how they would think about security for the rest of their lives. Parents carried a different weight. Many felt shame, even though the crash was far bigger than any single household. They worried about how others saw them. They asked themselves what they could have done differently. They felt they had failed, even though the truth was that the system had failed them. The guilt was heavy, and it often went unspoken. The shame of losing a home left scars that lasted long after the foreclosure itself. The emotional stress affected health as well. Families under foreclosure faced higher levels of anxiety and depression. Sleepless nights were common. Parents carried stress into their jobs, if they still had them, and into their relationships. The constant worry about where they would live next drained their energy. For some, the health effects lasted years, reminding them of the cost long after the economy improved. Communities looked for ways to cope. Some neighbors checked in on each other, sharing food or helping with moving. Local organizations offered temporary housing and support. Churches, nonprofits, and volunteers tried to fill the gaps left by the system. These acts of kindness did not erase the pain, but they softened it. They reminded families that even in loss, they were not completely alone. Entire cities were marked by foreclosure. In places where the housing boom had been strongest, the crash was hardest. Rows of unfinished or abandoned houses stood as silent witnesses to the storm. The landscape itself seemed to carry grief. For years afterward, these places were reminders of how quickly things could unravel. They became symbols of fragility as much as of growth. The economic effects were direct. When people lost their homes, they lost their largest source of wealth. Equity that had been built over years disappeared. Families who once felt they had a cushion were left with nothing. This loss widened inequality. Those who kept their homes during the crash often recovered faster. Those who lost them faced years of rebuilding. The gap grew wider, and the emotional pain added to the financial damage. Still, within the hardship, small moments of resilience appeared. Families learned to start again, sometimes renting modest apartments or moving in with relatives. They learned to live with less space, less comfort, and less certainty. Over time, many rebuilt their lives, though the memory of the loss never left. The strength it took to carry on became part of their story. It was not easy, but it was real. The loss of homes also changed how people thought about money. Before the crash, many believed that owning a home was the safest path to stability. Afterward, that belief was shaken. Some people became more cautious about borrowing. Others delayed buying homes for years, unsure if it was worth the risk. The trust that once fueled the housing market had been broken, and rebuilding it would take time. For policymakers, the wave of foreclosures showed the need for reform. New rules were discussed to prevent risky lending and to protect borrowers from predatory practices. Programs were introduced to help families refinance or keep their homes, though for many, the help came too late. The crisis reshaped how leaders thought about housing, credit, and financial safety nets. The lessons were hard, but they became part of the foundation for future protections. When we think about the crash today, the image of empty homes still stands out. They tell the story of loss in a way that numbers never can. A house left vacant is more than a statistic. It is the story of a family forced to leave behind their comfort, their memories, and their sense of belonging. The storm left scars across landscapes and lives, scars that remind us of the cost of fragile systems. The chapter of lost homes is a chapter of heartbreak. It is about more than money. It is about identity, trust, and safety. It shows how deeply financial events can reach into personal lives. It reminds us that numbers on a page can turn into boxes packed in a living room. It reminds us that money is never only financial. It is always emotional, always human. As you rest with this story, remember that the storm of foreclosures was not the end. It was one stage in a longer journey. The loss of homes was painful, but it was followed by other losses that touched even more lives. When jobs began to vanish, the storm grew heavier, pressing on families who were already struggling. That is the next part of the story, and it shows how wide the storm truly spread. The loss of homes was painful enough, but the storm did not stop there. As foreclosures spread and banks faltered, companies across the country began to feel the pressure. Businesses depended on loans to grow, to pay workers, and to keep products moving. When credit froze and customers cut back, those businesses faced impossible choices. The next stage of the crisis hit in the place that touched nearly everyone: the job market. At first, layoffs seemed isolated. A factory in one state closed, a store in another town shut its doors. News stories covered each case, but people still hoped it was temporary. As the months went on, though, the pattern became clear. Millions of jobs disappeared across industries. Manufacturing slowed, construction stopped, and retail sales fell. By the time the storm reached its peak, nearly 9 million jobs were gone. It was one of the sharpest rises in unemployment the nation had seen in generations. For families, the effect was immediate and heavy. A parent came home with the news that their position had been cut. A young worker out of college found no companies hiring. A middle-aged employee with decades of service was handed a pink slip and a box for their desk. Each story was personal, but together they painted a picture of widespread fear and uncertainty. The loss of income hit hard. Bills that were already difficult became impossible. Some families who had held on to their homes during the first wave of foreclosures now faced the risk of losing them because their paychecks had vanished. Credit cards filled the gap for a while, but debt only grew. Choices became harder each week. Do we pay for heat or for medicine? Do we buy enough groceries or make another payment on the mortgage? These decisions carried stress that never left. The emotional weight of job loss was just as sharp as the financial one. Work is more than a paycheck. It gives people purpose, routine, and identity. Without it, many felt lost. Days stretched with no structure. Confidence shrank. Shame grew, even when the crisis was far beyond individual control. People asked themselves why this happened to them, even though millions were asking the same question at the same time. Communities felt the pain together. Restaurants closed because no one could afford to eat out. Small shops went dark as customers disappeared. Local governments saw less tax revenue, which meant cuts to schools and services. Entire towns that had once been vibrant grew quiet. Job fairs were filled with anxious faces, each person competing for fewer openings. The crisis was not only about individuals, it was about entire regions struggling to survive. For young adults, the timing was devastating. Many entered the workforce during these years, only to find no jobs available. Some returned to school, hoping to wait out the storm. Others moved back in with parents, delaying independence. Life milestones, such as marriage, buying a home, or starting a family, were put off. Dreams were deferred, sometimes for years, because the foundation of stable work was missing. Even those who kept their jobs felt the pressure. Many accepted pay cuts, reduced hours, or unpaid furloughs. They worked in constant fear of being next. Workplaces carried a tension that was hard to ignore. Every meeting felt heavy. Every announcement from management carried dread. Survival was the mood of the time. Stability felt like a rare privilege. The health effects grew alongside the financial ones. Stress led to sleepless nights, headaches, and strained relationships. Depression and anxiety became more common. Families who once felt secure now carried the burden of uncertainty every day. The sense of control over life, already weakened by the loss of homes, was shattered further by the loss of jobs. People felt as if the ground beneath them was falling away. Government responses tried to slow the damage. Programs offered extended unemployment benefits. Stimulus plans aimed to keep businesses open. Job training and support programs were launched, but the scale of the crisis made recovery slow. For many, the help felt too small compared to the weight of their losses. The gap between policy and lived reality was wide. Despite the hardship, resilience appeared in small ways. Families adjusted. They cut costs, learned new skills, and leaned on each other. Neighbors shared resources, from meals to rides to job leads. Communities organized job clubs and support groups. These efforts did not erase the pain, but they helped people survive. Resilience grew in quiet acts of care, in the persistence of trying again, even after another rejection. Over time, new work appeared, though often in different forms. Some industries shrank, while others grew. The recovery created more part-time or temporary jobs rather than the stable careers many had lost. The shift left lasting marks on how people thought about work. Job security, once taken for granted by some, became something fragile. Many carried a permanent caution into their future choices. The storm of job loss also reshaped beliefs about money. Families learned that a single paycheck could not be relied on forever. Saving became more important when possible, even in small amounts. People thought more about having backup plans, side income, or new skills. The trauma of losing work turned into lessons about preparation, though those lessons often came with scars. Looking back, the wave of unemployment was one of the most painful parts of the crisis. Losing a home hurt deeply, but losing work touched even more lives. It was not limited to those who had borrowed risky loans. It affected people across backgrounds and industries. It spread widely, reminding everyone that financial storms do not stop at one door. They sweep through entire societies. The storm of job loss also set the stage for the next chapter of this story. As families lost both homes and incomes, the emotional aftershocks became unavoidable. Even after the economy began to stabilize, the fear remained. People carried financial anxiety into the future, shaping their choices, their health, and their trust in the system. That lasting impact is the hidden pain we must now explore. The loss of homes and the disappearance of jobs left visible scars, but the hidden pain ran even deeper. Once the storm passed its peak, families were left to face not only financial damage, but also the emotional weight that lingered. This part of the story is less about numbers and more about feelings. It is about the quiet aftershocks that lived in hearts and minds long after the loud collapse had ended. When people lose work and homes, they do not only lose money, they lose trust. They lose confidence in themselves and in the systems that once promised stability. Even as markets started to recover, many people found it hard to believe that safety could return. They carried the memory of the storm with them, like a shadow that followed every decision. Financial anxiety became common. Even small choices like going to the grocery store or opening a utility bill carried more stress. The fear of falling behind never truly left. Families worried about whether another crisis was always just around the corner. This constant worry drained energy and attention. It made rest difficult. Nights were filled with thoughts of what if, and mornings started with knots in the stomach. The aftershock also showed up as shame. Many people blamed themselves for what happened, even though the system had been stacked against them. Parents felt they had failed their children by losing homes or jobs. Workers questioned their worth after being laid off, even if the loss had nothing to do with their performance. Shame took root in silence. It was not often spoken aloud, but it lived inside, heavy and isolating. This emotional toll reached across generations. Children who saw their parents struggle absorbed the lessons without words. Some grew cautious with money, always afraid of losing it. Others avoided thinking about finances at all because it felt tied to pain. The memories of stress became part of family culture. Even years later, those children carried the echo of that time into their own adult choices. Trust in institutions was damaged. Before the crash, many people believed banks were safe, that regulators would protect them, and that markets followed rules. After the crisis, those beliefs were harder to hold. Watching large banks receive bailouts, while ordinary families lost everything, created bitterness. The sense of unfairness stayed. People asked why help seemed to flow upward, while they were left to struggle alone. The emotional aftershock also showed itself in how people approached investing. Many pulled out of the stock market and stayed away for years. They were afraid to risk losing again. Retirement savings were left sitting in cash, earning little because the fear of loss outweighed the hope of growth. The experience of watching accounts shrink so quickly made people cautious, even when the recovery eventually came. Relationships were strained under this weight. Couples argued about money more often. Divorce rates climbed in some areas, fueled by stress and blame. Friendships were tested when people withdrew into isolation or could no longer afford shared activities. The sense of community weakened under the pressure. It was not only finances that broke down, but also the bonds that gave people strength. Health suffered as well. Anxiety and depression became more common. Stress showed up in physical ways through illness, exhaustion, and lack of sleep. Hospitals and clinics saw patients who were not only sick, but also weighed down by the emotional aftermath of financial stress. The connection between money and health became clearer than ever. Financial pain was not separate from well-being. It was deeply tied to it. Yet, even in this heavy time, seeds of resilience grew. Some families began talking more openly about money, breaking patterns of silence. Support groups formed both locally and online, where people could share stories and feel less alone. Slowly, conversations about financial stress started to shift from private shame to shared struggle. This openness was not easy, but it was healing. The emotional aftershock also sparked new conversations about fairness and reform. People began to question the old assumptions about debt, lending, and risk. They pushed for changes in how mortgages were written and how banks were supervised. Out of the pain came a desire for protection and accountability. While reforms did not erase the trauma, they showed that lessons were being learned and that some change was possible. The hardest part of the aftershock was how long it lasted. Even after markets rose again and unemployment dropped, the emotional scars remained. Fear of another collapse lived in decisions for years. People delayed buying homes or starting families because they worried about stability. Even small financial steps felt risky. It was as if the storm lived on in memory, shaping choices long after the skies had cleared. Healing from this stage took time. It required both personal reflection and systemic change. Families needed space to grieve their losses, and they needed support to rebuild their sense of safety. Communities needed to come together again to restore trust and connection. The emotional aftershock reminded everyone that recovery is not only about numbers returning to normal, it is about people finding peace again after being shaken to their core. The story of the emotional aftershock is essential because it explains why money feels heavy for so many, even today. The fear you might carry when looking at your bank account or the hesitation you feel about making big choices is tied to that time. It is not weakness, it is memory. It is the echo of a collective trauma that shaped an entire generation. As you rest with this chapter, remember that financial pain is not only about numbers, it is about feelings, trust, and identity. It is about the quiet nights when worry kept people awake, and the long days when shame whispered that they had failed. These experiences mattered, and they still matter. They explain why healing from financial trauma is as important as rebuilding wealth. The emotional aftershock was not the end of the story. It was part of the journey toward change. In the chapters ahead, we will see how governments and institutions tried to steady the system, offering lifelines to banks and, eventually, to communities. These rescue efforts were controversial, but they were a turning point. They showed how far leaders were willing to go to keep the system from total collapse. The emotional aftershock was spreading, and fear was tightening its grip on families and communities. With banks failing and markets shaking, leaders faced a choice. If nothing was done, the financial system could collapse completely. If too much was done, people would accuse them of rescuing institutions, while leaving ordinary citizens to suffer. The path forward was not simple. It became what many called the Bailout Balancing Act. In Washington, lawmakers and officials gathered in urgent meetings. They looked at reports that showed the depth of the crisis. Major banks were running out of money. Lending between institutions had slowed almost to a stop. Without new action, paychecks might bounce, businesses might close overnight, and even basic banking services could fail. The risk was not only financial, it was social and political as well. The first major step was a program that injected money directly into banks. Billions of dollars were provided with the goal of keeping those banks alive long enough to restore trust. This was not a popular decision. Many families were losing their homes while watching banks receive lifelines. To them, it felt unfair. They asked, "Why are the people who caused the crisis being rescued while we are left with nothing?" That question hung heavily in the air. The government defended its choice by explaining that the collapse of large banks would hurt everyone. If banks failed, businesses would not get loans, workers would not get paid, and the crisis would grow worse. In their view, saving the institutions was a way of saving the system itself. They described it as putting out a fire before it spread to every house on the block. Too many people, though, it still looked like the firefighters were protecting the mansions while small homes burned. Beyond direct bank support, other measures were taken to calm the storm. The central bank cut interest rates to near zero, making borrowing cheaper. Programs were introduced to buy troubled assets from financial institutions, clearing toxic debt off their books. These steps were meant to unfreeze credit so that money could flow again through businesses, consumers, and communities. The hope was that stability would return if confidence could be restored. The results were mixed. On Wall Street, some confidence did return. Markets that had been falling non-stop began to steady. Investors saw that the government was willing to act, which slowed the panic. But on Main Street, the pain continued. Families still faced foreclosure. Jobs were still disappearing. The gap between what was being done at the top and what was being felt at the bottom created resentment. The idea of fairness became one of the lasting wounds of the bailout era. For families watching, the language of financial rescue felt distant. Terms like toxic assets and capital injections did not ease the fear of losing a job or a home. What mattered to them was survival, and survival was still uncertain. The Bailout Balancing Act may have steadied the system, but it did not steady the lives of those already drowning in debt and loss. That gap created mistrust that lasted for years. At the same time, there were quiet victories in the effort to stabilize. Some industries were saved from collapse. The auto industry, for example, received support that allowed it to survive and later recover. Millions of jobs were tied to that sector, so the bailout prevented further devastation. Though controversial, it showed how the Balancing Act was not only about banks, it was about keeping entire pillars of the economy from falling. The emotional response to these bailouts was complicated. Some people felt relief, believing that without them, the country would have entered a depression worse than the 1930s. Others felt betrayed, seeing the bailouts as proof that the system favored the powerful. Both feelings were true in their own way. The bailouts did prevent a deeper collapse, but they also left many citizens feeling abandoned. That tension is part of why the memory of this period remains so strong. Over time, new debates began about how to prevent such a crisis from happening again. Leaders admitted that regulations had been too weak. They promised reforms that would hold banks accountable and protect consumers. Out of the storm came new rules that aimed to create guardrails, but those changes would take time to appear. In the moment, the focus remained on keeping the system from breaking apart entirely. The balancing act was not perfect, but it showed the desperate choices that crises create. Leaders had to weigh saving institutions against the anger of the people. They had to act quickly, knowing that each decision carried both costs and benefits. For the families at home, it was hard to see the bigger picture when their daily lives were filled with struggle. The divide between systemic rescue and personal pain became one of the defining features of the crash. As the storm began to calm, people started asking deeper questions. What protections would be put in place to make sure this never happened again? How could trust be rebuilt in a system that had failed so many? And most importantly, what lessons could be learned from the way the crisis had been handled? These questions guided the next stage of the story, where reform and rebuilding took center stage. The Bailout Balancing Act was a chapter of tension. It was about survival, fairness, and the hard trade-offs of crisis leadership. It left scars, but it also kept the system alive long enough for recovery to begin. The story now moves to those reforms, the new rules and structures that promise to make the system safer and give people a reason to believe again. The bailouts had slowed the collapse, but they had not erased the pain. Families still carried the weight of loss, and trust in the system was badly shaken. Leaders knew that simply patching the cracks was not enough. If confidence was to be rebuilt, new rules had to be written. The system had to be reshaped so that the same storm could not sweep through again. In the years after the crash, lawmakers worked on reforms that aimed to protect people and prevent risky behavior in banks. One of the most significant steps was the creation of stronger oversight. Banks were told they had to hold more reserves, meaning they needed larger safety cushions in case of trouble. They were also tested through stress scenarios, which asked a simple question: could this bank survive another crisis like 2008? If the answer was no, changes had to be made. These tests may have sounded technical, but their purpose was simple. They were designed to make sure that ordinary people's savings would not be swept away by reckless decisions at the top. For many, it was a relief to know that banks were no longer free to take the same level of risks without oversight. The memory of the crash was too fresh to allow the same mistakes. Another key change was the creation of an agency focused entirely on protecting consumers. This agency was tasked with watching over mortgages, credit cards, and other financial products that touched daily life. It forced lenders to be clearer about terms, to avoid deceptive practices, and to give borrowers a fair chance. For families who had once signed contracts filled with hidden traps, this change mattered. It meant that future loans had to be more transparent. Reforms also touched the way complex financial products were created and sold. The packaging of risky loans into investments that looked safe had been one of the sparks of the crash. New rules required more honesty about the risks inside those packages. Rating agencies that had once stamped them as safe were now held to higher standards. The goal was to prevent another bubble from forming unnoticed. For many citizens, these changes brought cautious hope. They wanted to believe that the pain they had endured had led to something useful. The idea that rules were now in place to stop predatory lending or reckless speculation offered comfort. Yet for some, trust was harder to rebuild. Had lost too much to feel confident again quickly. It would take more than laws to heal the wounds left behind. Communities that had been hit hardest by foreclosures and job loss still bore the scars. Empty homes stood as reminders of what had happened. Families continued to struggle with debt and damaged credit scores. Even as reforms were introduced, the daily lives of many were slow to improve. Rules could prevent future storms, but they could not erase the pain of the last one overnight. Still, the act of reform itself mattered. It showed that lessons had been learned, at least in part. It showed that leaders were willing to admit mistakes and try to create a safer system. For many, that acknowledgement was a step toward healing. Knowing that the system was being rebuilt gave people a reason to hope that their children might face a steadier future. The image of safer shores comes to mind. After a shipwreck, survivors look for land where they can rest, rebuild, and feel secure. These new rules were not perfect, but they were steps toward that shore. They were an attempt to give people ground that would not collapse beneath them again. Families who had been tossed by the storm wanted nothing more than to feel safe enough to stand still. Reforms also reshaped the conversation about responsibility. The crash had shown that unchecked risk at the top could ruin lives at the bottom. By introducing accountability, the system began to recognize that stability was not only about profit, it was also about fairness and protection. This shift in thinking was slow, but it was important. It changed how many people viewed the role of banks and government in financial life. For those living through this period, the memory of loss remained sharp, but alongside that memory grew a sense of resilience. People learned to be more cautious, to ask more questions, and to take fewer things at face value. They became more aware of their rights as consumers. They looked for clarity before signing loans. This cultural shift was part of the healing, a quiet way of building strength after being shaken. The new rules did not erase risk altogether. No system can be made perfectly safe, but they created guardrails that made another collapse less likely. They slowed down the pace of risky behavior and increased the focus on protection. For families still anxious about the future, these rules offered at least a measure of reassurance. It was not the return of blind trust, but it was the start of cautious belief. This chapter of reform was about rebuilding the ground beneath people's feet. It was about showing that out of the pain of collapse, change could grow. The storm had revealed deep weaknesses, and the new rules were an attempt to fill those cracks with stronger foundations. Whether perfect or not, they represented progress. They were the beginning of a path toward safer shores. As this story moves forward, the focus turns from policy to people. Laws and rules can provide structure, but true healing happens in the lives of families and communities. The next part of the journey is about how individuals began to recover, how they slowly rebuilt not only their finances, but also their sense of hope. It is about healing financial wounds one step at a time. The new rules gave people a sense that the system was safer, but healing went beyond laws and institutions. Families and communities had lived through loss, fear, and shame. They carried heavy emotional scars. Healing those wounds took time, patience, and small steps toward rebuilding lives. This chapter is about how people began to recover, not in sudden leaps, but in steady movements that slowly restored a sense of stability. For many, healing started with finding new work. Jobs returned gradually as the economy began to stabilize. Factories restarted production, stores reopened, and companies slowly gained the confidence to hire again. For someone who had been unemployed for months, receiving a job offer felt like a lifeline. It was more than income. It was a return to purpose and routine. Even if the pay was lower than before, even if the hours were shorter, it was a step back toward normal life. Housing recovery took longer, but it came. Families who had lost their homes moved into rentals, often smaller or less comfortable than what they had before. Over time, some saved enough to buy again. They entered the process more cautiously, asking questions they had not asked before, making sure the terms were clear and sustainable. The experience of losing a home had left a mark, but it also left wisdom. People learned to approach ownership with more awareness. Credit scores, damaged by foreclosure or missed payments, became another obstacle. Rebuilding them was slow. Families made payments on time, little by little, watching their scores climb year by year. It was frustrating at times, but it also built resilience. Each small improvement felt like a victory. The act of rebuilding credit was not only financial, it was emotional proof that healing was possible, even after deep loss. Communities also began to heal together. In neighborhoods where many homes had been abandoned, people organized efforts to restore them. Vacant houses were repaired or repurposed. Community groups created support networks for those still struggling. Churches and nonprofits continued to provide food, counseling, and financial education. These collective efforts reminded people that they were not facing recovery alone. Healing was a shared process. Talking about money became more open in some households. Parents who had once hidden financial stress from their children began to share lessons. They explained what had happened, why it was hard, and what they had learned. This openness helped reduce shame. It also gave younger generations a more realistic view of money. Instead of pretending everything was fine, families started to face financial conversations together. That honesty became part of the healing. Emotional healing required space for grief. Losing a home or a job was like losing part of one's identity. Families needed time to mourn those losses. Some found peace through counseling. Others leaned on friends or faith communities. Healing came through telling stories, sharing memories, and acknowledging pain. By naming what they had gone through, people began to release the weight of silent shame. At the same time, small financial rituals became important. Families started keeping emergency savings, even if it was only a few $100s at first. They created simple budgets, not as strict punishments, but as tools for calm. Some set aside regular family nights to talk about money, making it less of a hidden subject. These rituals gave people a sense of control. They turned fear into preparation, and preparation into peace. Healing also meant redefining what wealth and security meant. Before the crash, many believed that wealth was measured by the size of a house or the growth of investments. After the crash, people learned that true security was simpler. It was having enough to cover needs, enough to rest without fear, and enough to face the future without constant worry. This redefinition allowed many to live with more gratitude and less comparison. The process of healing was uneven. Some families recovered quickly, while others took years. Some never fully regained what they had lost, but they found peace in new ways of living. The scars of the crash did not disappear, but they became less painful over time. They turned into lessons, into reminders of resilience, into proof that survival was possible even in the hardest storms. For children who had lived through the crisis, healing meant finding stability again. As parents found work and homes became secure, children felt safer. They watched routines return. They saw their families laugh again after years of worry. These moments of stability helped repair the fear they had carried. The memory of instability remained, but it was softened by the return of normal life. The larger society also worked on healing. Schools introduced more financial education. Organizations promoted awareness of saving and budgeting. Governments held hearings to reflect on what had gone wrong. The national conversation shifted to include not only numbers, but also the human cost of financial systems. The recognition of pain was part of the healing. It showed that what families had endured was not invisible. Healing financial wounds did not mean erasing the past. It meant accepting it, learning from it, and carrying forward with new strength. It meant building habits that honored the lessons of hardship. It meant teaching the next generation to be cautious, but also hopeful. The wounds left scars, but scars can remind us of resilience as much as of pain. As people slowly regained their balance, they began to look toward the future again. Dreams that had been put aside started to return. Plans for education, small businesses, or retirement were revived. The process was not fast, but it was real. The ability to hope again was itself a sign of healing. After so much fear, hope was powerful. This chapter of healing shows us that recovery is not only about the system or the economy, it is about people finding their way back to safety, dignity, and peace. It is about families learning new habits, communities finding strength together, and individuals redefining what security means. It is about the quiet courage of rebuilding life, one small step at a time. But healing was not the end of the story. It opened the door to new lessons. From the ashes of the crisis, people began to reflect on what resilience really means. They asked themselves what habits and choices could help them face the next storm more calmly. They began to see that financial health was not only about wealth, but about wisdom. That reflection is where our story goes next. Healing financial wounds was only part of the journey. Once families regained a sense of stability, the question became how to stay steady in the future. Out of the pain of the crisis came lessons that reshaped how people thought about money. These were not lessons taught in classrooms or found in textbooks. They were learned through lived experience, through loss, recovery, and reflection. They became quiet truths about resilience. One of the clearest lessons was the importance of saving. During the crash, families who had even a small cushion of money found it easier to weather the storm. They still struggled, but the savings gave them time to adjust. Those without any cushion fell into crisis more quickly. From this experience, many people began keeping emergency funds, even if small. The habit of saving for unexpected events became a key lesson carried forward. Another lesson was about debt. Before the crisis, borrowing felt easy. Loans were offered quickly, credit cards arrived in the mail, and many people believed they could always refinance or sell if needed. The crash showed how dangerous too much debt could be. When jobs disappeared and prices fell, debt turned into a heavy chain. Afterward, people became more cautious about borrowing. They thought twice before taking on loans that stretched their budgets. This caution became part of resilience. Investing also carried a new perspective. Many who had pulled their money from the stock market during the panic regretted it later, when markets recovered. Those who stayed invested eventually saw their accounts grow again. The crisis taught that markets can fall sharply, but history shows they also rise over time. Patience became a quiet form of strength. The lesson was not about chasing wealth, but about trusting long-term growth instead of reacting to short-term fear. Families also learned the value of talking openly about money. Silence had made the pain of the crash harder. Many parents had hidden their struggles, which created confusion and shame for children. Afterward, some households made a new habit of discussing finances together. They created budgets as families, shared goals, and explained choices. This openness reduced fear and built collective resilience. Money became less of a secret and more of a shared responsibility. Another lesson was the need for flexibility. The crisis showed that life could change suddenly. Jobs could vanish, homes could be lost, and plans could collapse. Those who adapted quickly, finding new work, cutting costs, or learning new skills, were better able to survive. Flexibility became a form of resilience. It was not about expecting disaster, but about being ready to adjust when life shifted. Communities also discovered the strength of connection. During the hardest years, neighbors helped each other, churches offered support, and volunteers stepped forward. These acts of care showed that resilience was not only individual, it was collective. People found that leaning on others and offering help in return created strength that went beyond money. Trust in community became another quiet lesson of the time. Psychological resilience grew as well. Families learned that fear could not be erased but could be managed. They developed small rituals to calm themselves, such as reviewing their budgets once a week, or setting aside money automatically for savings. These rituals gave structure in uncertain times. They turned chaos into something more manageable. Over time, the rituals became habits that built confidence. The lessons of resilience were often simple, but they carried deep meaning. Save when you can. Borrow carefully. Stay patient with investments. Talk openly. Stay flexible. Lean on community. Build calming habits. Each of these came from hardship, but together they created a foundation stronger than before. They became guides for facing the future with more peace. Children who lived through the crisis carried these lessons into adulthood. They remembered the fear of seeing parents lose jobs or homes, and they promised themselves to prepare differently. Some chose careers with more stability. Others became more frugal or more focused on saving. Their approach to money was shaped not by theory, but by memory. The resilience they built as children turned into wisdom as adults. The larger society absorbed these lessons too. Schools began to add financial literacy to their programs. Employers offered more education about saving for retirement. Policymakers emphasized the need for stronger safety nets. The crash had revealed vulnerabilities, and resilience became a shared goal. While the scars remained, the determination to avoid repeating the same mistakes gave people direction. Yet, resilience did not mean forgetting the pain. The memory of the crisis stayed alive in decisions. People continued to feel cautious about taking risks. They questioned headlines about booming markets. They reminded themselves that growth could be fragile. This caution was not always negative. It kept people grounded, aware that resilience is not about avoiding storms, but about being prepared to endure them. For many, resilience also meant redefining success. Before the crash, success was often measured in bigger houses, newer cars, and constant growth. Afterward, people saw that these measures could collapse overnight. They began to value different things: stability, security, peace of mind. Success became about sleeping at night without fear, about having enough rather than always chasing more. This redefinition was a profound lesson. Healing had turned into growth, and growth had turned into resilience. Each small step mattered. Families who once felt broken learned that survival itself was a form of strength. Communities that had been battered learned that solidarity created hope. A generation that had been scarred by the crisis carried forward lessons that shaped how they lived and how they planned for the future. These lessons in resilience mark a turning point in the story. They show that even after deep pain, people can build new strength. They remind us that financial health is not only about wealth, but about habits, choices, and mindsets that provide peace. They teach that resilience is both practical and emotional, both personal and collective. As the recovery continued, resilience opened the door to renewal. People who had learned these lessons began to rebuild with more wisdom. They began to plant seeds for a future that looked different from the past. The crisis had taken much, but it had also given perspective. And from that perspective came the chance to grow in new ways. The next stage of this journey is about renewal. It is about how the economy, families, and individuals began to see growth again. It is about how new opportunities emerged and how people turned their resilience into forward motion. That renewal is the story we turn to next. Resilience had been planted in the soil of hardship, but it was only the beginning. After the crisis, families, communities, and even entire economies started to rebuild. It was not a sudden transformation. It was more like planting seeds after a storm and waiting for growth to appear. The years that followed showed that healing could lead to renewal, and that broken ground could still support new life. In the early years, recovery felt slow. Jobs returned, but often in smaller numbers or with lower pay. Families worked hard to climb back from debt and loss. Yet each paycheck earned and each bill paid became part of the new growth. People learned to celebrate small wins, like saving a little more or paying off a loan. These victories, while modest, gave a sense of forward motion. Housing markets also began to stabilize. At first, prices in many regions stayed flat or even fell further, but over time, they began to rise again. Families who had once feared that housing was no longer safe started to feel some relief. Those who held onto their homes saw values return. Those who had lost homes began to think about buying again, this time more carefully. The garden of housing slowly sprouted new shoots of life. The stock market also recovered, though it took patience. For years after the crash, many people stayed away, still shaken by the memory of sudden loss. Yet for those who stayed invested, the growth was undeniable. Over the decade that followed, the market climbed steadily. What had once been cut in half eventually doubled, then tripled. The lesson of patience turned into proof that waiting through the storm could bring reward. Communities rebuilt together. Vacant homes were renovated, turning empty spaces into new beginnings. Local businesses reopened, often with more cautious plans but stronger foundations. Neighborhoods that had felt broken began to buzz with life again. Schools regained students, stores regained customers, and towns regained hope. The collective effort of rebuilding gave people pride in their resilience. Families also reimagined their goals. Before the crash, many chased bigger houses, new cars, and rapid growth. Afterward, the focus shifted. People valued simpler stability. They wanted savings that could carry them through hard times, steady jobs that felt secure, and lives that balanced comfort with caution. The garden they grew was not about showing off wealth, but about creating peace. For children who had lived through the storm, this period of renewal was powerful. They saw their parents working hard to rebuild. They learned the value of patience, of saving, and of making careful choices. These children grew into adults who carried those lessons with them. Their vision of money was different from the generation before. They were more likely to see wealth as something tied to security and peace rather than endless growth. Renewal also meant embracing new opportunities. The economy shifted after the crisis, with technology growing rapidly. Many found work in new industries that had not been as strong before. Online businesses, digital tools, and creative services grew. These changes gave people different ways to earn and adapt. They were reminders that even after collapse, new paths could open. The recovery also showed the importance of long-term perspective. People who had lost faith in markets slowly returned as they saw growth continue. Families who once feared buying homes found confidence again. The passage of time helped soften the memory of loss, and the sight of steady improvement restored hope. Renewal was not fast, but it was steady, like a garden that takes years to bloom. The lessons of resilience shaped the way people approached this growth. They saved more, borrowed less, and stayed cautious. They did not forget the storm, but they used its memory to build better habits. This careful approach meant that the new growth felt more stable. The garden that grew from the ashes was not perfect, but it was rooted in wisdom. On a larger scale, the recovery of the economy proved that systems could bend without breaking completely. The crash had shown how fragile things could be, but the rebound showed how strong collective effort could become. Markets, businesses, and workers all played a part in rebuilding. The resilience of individuals joined with the resilience of institutions to create a more balanced recovery. Families who once feared they would never recover began to dream again. They saved for education, planned for retirement, and considered future goals. The act of dreaming itself was a sign of healing. It meant that fear was no longer the only voice in their lives. Hope had returned, steady and quiet, guiding choices with confidence. The financial garden that grew after the crisis was not uniform. Some families thrived more quickly than others. Some regions rebounded faster than others. Inequality remained, and not every wound healed fully. Yet the overall direction was upward. Growth, though uneven, showed that the storm had not erased the possibility of renewal. It had only changed the way growth was pursued. For many, the most important part of this renewal was emotional. Trust slowly returned. People began to believe again in their ability to build stable lives. They carried scars, but they also carried strength. They looked at their progress and saw that survival had turned into growth. The financial garden was proof that life could continue after devastation. This stage of renewal also prepared people for the future. Having lived through crisis, they knew storms could come again. But now they had the tools to face them with less fear. They had savings, habits, and lessons to guide them. They had rebuilt before, and they knew they could do it again if needed. That knowledge itself was resilience turned into confidence. The story of renewal is not only about money, it is about the human spirit. It is about how people can plant new seeds even in broken soil, and how they can find joy again after hardship. It is about growth that is quieter, steadier, and more rooted than before. That kind of growth is what keeps people moving forward with peace. But renewal did not happen in isolation. It was supported by something deeper, the strength of communities, families, and shared struggles. In the next part of this story, we turn to that collective strength. We will see how people discovered they were stronger together, and how unity became a force for healing. The renewal that followed the crisis was not built by individuals alone. It was carried by neighbors, families, and communities who chose to face the future together. The storm had revealed how fragile life could be when trust was broken. But it also revealed how strong people could become when they supported one another. Out of hardship grew a sense of connection, a reminder that money is not only about numbers, it is also about relationships. During the worst of the storm, many families found comfort in small acts of kindness. A neighbor brought over a meal when groceries were scarce. A relative offered a spare room when a family lost their home. Churches and community centers opened their doors to provide food and counseling. These gestures may have seemed simple, but to those receiving them, they were lifelines. They showed that even when systems failed, people could still show up for each other. Communities learned that survival was stronger when it was shared. In towns where foreclosures had left rows of empty houses, neighbors organized cleanup days. They mowed lawns, boarded up windows, and planted flowers to keep the spirit of the community alive. These efforts did not erase the losses, but they created pride and unity. They reminded everyone that even in broken places, beauty and care could grow. Families also became closer during this period. Parents began including children in conversations about money, teaching them the importance of saving, budgeting, and patience. What had once been silent or avoided became shared lessons. Children learned from their parents' struggles, and parents found strength in being honest rather than hiding their fears. This openness built bonds that lasted beyond the crisis. Support groups formed, both locally and online. People shared their stories, their worries, and their tips for coping. Hearing others describe the same fears helped to reduce the weight of shame. The message was clear. You were not failing alone. You were part of a larger struggle. This sense of belonging was powerful. It gave people courage to keep trying, even when the road back felt long. Stronger together also meant political voices grew louder. Citizens who had been hurt by the crash began to demand reforms. They pushed for protections against predatory lending, for more oversight of banks, and for stronger safety nets. Their voices helped shape the policies that followed. Collective pain became collective action, proving that resilience was not only personal. The strength of connection appeared in workplaces too. Employees who kept their jobs supported colleagues who had lost theirs, helping with resumes or sharing job leads. Small businesses leaned on loyal customers who chose to support them even in tough times. The idea of community extended into the economy itself, where relationships and trust became as valuable as dollars. Even as recovery spread, the memory of shared struggles stayed alive. People remembered how neighbors helped them move, how coworkers shared lunches, how communities gathered to care for children. These memories shaped how they thought about wealth and success. Many realized that true wealth was not only financial, it was also measured in trust, friendship, and solidarity. The crisis also highlighted the importance of collective safety nets. Programs like unemployment benefits, food assistance, and health coverage became lifelines for millions. These supports showed how society could come together through government action, not only through personal acts of kindness. While not perfect, they proved that collective structures could ease suffering and create space for healing. Children who grew up during this time often saw community strength firsthand. They remembered volunteers handing out food, teachers offering extra patience, and families leaning on relatives. These images shaped their understanding of resilience. They learned that hard times are survived not only through personal effort, but through shared care. This became part of their values as they grew older. The lesson of being stronger together also influenced how people approached money in daily life. Some joined credit unions, valuing local ownership and community focus. Others supported local businesses more intentionally. The idea that money could circulate within communities to create mutual benefit grew stronger. It was a quiet shift, but one that carried lasting meaning. On a broader level, the crash reminded the world that economies are interconnected. When one nation suffers, others feel the effects. This realization encouraged cooperation among countries to stabilize markets and prevent future crises. The sense of being stronger together extended beyond borders, highlighting that financial health is global as well as local. Yet the most lasting impact of this chapter was emotional. People who had once felt isolated in their struggles realized they were part of a larger story. They were not alone in losing homes, jobs, or savings. They were part of a generation that had endured, adapted, and rebuilt. This awareness created pride and solidarity. It reminded people that hardship could create bonds that prosperity never could. The garden of renewal grew stronger roots when nurtured by connection. Families, neighbors, and communities found hope in each other. The scars of the crash did not vanish, but they were softened by the memory of shared resilience. This collective strength became one of the greatest legacies of the crisis. As the story moves forward, we turn to the final stage of this journey. Having faced the storm, endured the aftershocks, and rebuilt together. People began to look toward the horizon with fresh eyes. They started to imagine new beginnings, new definitions of wealth, and new dreams that felt possible again. This hopeful dawn is where our story goes next. The years after the crisis carried both scars and wisdom. People had endured the loss of homes, the shock of unemployment, and the sting of broken trust. They had rebuilt, step by step, finding strength in resilience and in community. As the dust settled, a new chapter opened. It was not about forgetting the past, but about reimagining the future. This stage was a dawn, a softer light after a long night, where lessons turned into guidance and hope became possible again. Families began to see that their relationship with money was not fixed. It was a story they could rewrite. The crash had shown how fragile life could be when choices were made in blindness. But it had also shown how strong people could be when they learned, adapted, and connected. The narrative shifted from shame to reflection. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" people began to ask, "What can I learn from what happened?" The new dawn was shaped by different priorities. Before the storm, success was often measured in material terms, in the size of a house, the model of a car, or the number in a bank account. Afterward, success became about stability, peace of mind, and freedom from fear. A modest home that felt secure carried more meaning than a mansion at risk. A steady job that provided dignity became more valuable than a role that promised riches but carried insecurity. The crash had changed the definition of wealth. For younger generations, the new dawn meant growing up with a more cautious, but also more thoughtful view of money. They had seen their parents or relatives lose jobs, homes, or savings. They carried those memories into adulthood. Many became more careful about debt, more committed to saving, and more skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. Their financial storytelling began with the lessons of crisis, and that gave them perspective their parents had not carried at the same age. This period also opened conversations about money that had been avoided for too long. Families started teaching children about budgeting, credit, and saving. Schools began adding financial literacy to their lessons. Communities created workshops and resources to support those still struggling. Money, once treated as a private subject, became something people could talk about openly. The silence that had once fueled shame was slowly being broken. At the same time, the financial system itself tried to build trust through clearer rules. Lenders were required to explain terms more plainly. Protections were added to prevent some of the worst practices that had trapped borrowers before. While not perfect, these steps gave families a sense that they were entering agreements with more transparency. This openness was a small but important part of rebuilding confidence. The dawn was not only about policies and habits, it was also about healing emotionally. People needed to believe again that money could be a tool for living rather than a constant source of fear. They learned to approach finances with mindfulness. Some created calming routines, like setting aside time each month to review their accounts without judgment. Others found peace in simple acts of saving, even if the amounts were small. These practices gave them a sense of control and calm. Communities also carried forward the lessons of unity. They remembered the importance of being stronger together. Neighbors continued to support local businesses. Credit unions grew in popularity as people sought institutions they felt connected to. Volunteer groups and nonprofits expanded their missions to include financial education and assistance. The memory of shared struggle kept alive the idea that resilience was best when it was collective. For many, the new dawn also meant giving themselves permission to dream again. During the darkest years, dreams had felt dangerous, as if hope could collapse overnight. But as stability returned, people began to imagine new goals. Some went back to school, others started small businesses, and many began saving for homes or retirement with more confidence. Dreams were not about extravagance. They were about choice, safety, and freedom. That shift gave people a sense of empowerment that had been missing. The new dawn was not without shadows. Inequality grew in some areas, as those who had resources recovered faster than those who did not. Some wounds of the crisis never fully healed. But even in those shadows, there was awareness that change was possible. People spoke more openly about fairness, about reform, and about the need for systems that protected everyone, not only a few. This awareness itself was a form of progress. The story of this dawn is not about perfection. It is about growth after loss, clarity after confusion, and strength after weakness. It is about ordinary families who endured extraordinary hardship and still found ways to rise. It is about the power of remembering and the courage of rewriting the story. It is about creating a relationship with money that is rooted in wisdom and peace rather than fear and shame. As we reach this stage, we see that financial storytelling has become more than history. It is a guide for the future. The crisis gave lessons that no one wanted, but that everyone needed. It showed that stability matters more than illusion, that transparency matters more than promises, and that resilience matters more than constant growth. These lessons became the foundation of a new financial culture. This new dawn also planted the seeds of responsibility for future generations. Parents told their children not only the happy parts of money stories, but also the painful ones. They explained what had happened, what was lost, and what was learned. These stories became part of family history, shaping how the next generation would think about money. In this way, the pain of the past turned into wisdom for the future. In the quiet of this dawn, the most important lesson was simple. Wealth is not only about numbers, it is about safety, freedom, and the ability to rest at night without fear. It is about having enough to live with dignity, to care for loved ones, and to face the unknown with confidence. That truth became clear after the storm, and it remains the heart of the new story. The new dawn is not the end of the journey, it is a beginning. From here, people carry forward the lessons of the past into the choices of tomorrow. The story of money continues, shaped by resilience, community, and hope. What comes next is the reflection, the gentle weaving together of everything learned to offer peace for the nights ahead. The story of the 2008 financial crash began with calm, moved through collapse, and ended with renewal. Along the way, it revealed the fragile nature of money and the deep resilience of people. Now, as we close this journey, we return to the heart of why it matters. This was never only about houses, jobs, or markets. It was about people learning to live again after loss and finding peace in the lessons carried forward. We saw how the calm before the storm made people believe the dream of endless growth would never end. We saw how the bubble grew until it burst, leaving families with bills they could not pay and homes they could not keep. We walked through the storm of collapsing banks, lost jobs, and shrinking savings. We felt the pain of shame, anxiety, and sleepless nights. Those memories were heavy, but they also shaped the truths that still guide us today. The story also showed the hidden side of healing. People rebuilt homes, repaired credit, and found work again. They learned to save, to borrow more carefully, and to talk more openly about money. They discovered that resilience lives not only in numbers but in spirit. Communities came together, showing that connection makes hardship lighter. Families redefined success, placing peace and stability above appearances. Out of pain grew wisdom. Out of loss grew strength. What remains now are the lessons. Save when you can, even in small amounts. Borrow carefully, knowing that debt can turn heavy in hard times. Stay patient, remembering that markets rise and fall, but often recover with time. Talk openly about money, because silence breeds shame. Rely on community, because together is stronger than alone. Most of all, remember that wealth is not measured only in possessions. True wealth is feeling safe, free, and able to rest without fear. The scars of the crisis are still there, but they do not only mark loss, they mark survival. They show that families endured the storm and kept going. They show that communities, though shaken, found ways to stand together. They show that even after systems break, people can write new stories with more clarity, more compassion, and more peace. These scars are not signs of weakness. They are signs of resilience. Tonight, as you rest, let this story settle gently inside you. You have walked through the calm, the storm, and the dawn. You have seen how fragile money can be, but also how strong people can become. You have heard how pain turns into wisdom and how resilience shapes a more peaceful future. These lessons are not only about history, they are about you, your choices, your relationship with money, and the way you carry it forward. So maybe tonight you can let go of some of the worry you hold. You can forgive yourself for what you did not know in the past. You can remind yourself that you are still learning, still growing, still worthy of peace. The storm of 2008 is behind us, but its lessons are here to guide you. They whisper that safety is possible, that healing is real, and that your story is still being written. And tomorrow, as a new day begins, you will remember this truth. Your financial story is not fixed. It is alive, shaped by your choices, your resilience, and your hope. The past may have left scars, but the future is still open. You are allowed to write it gently. You are allowed to rest, to dream, and to step forward with calm. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that you are enough, and that your journey with money, like this story, can lead to peace.